Come blast off in my time machine. Third eye feeling like an Evazine. Blast off, blast off, blast off, blast off. Come blast off in my time machine. Third eye feeling like an Evazine. Blast off, blast off, blast off, blast off.
It is a scorcher today, and I just don't mean the weather here in Las Vegas where HEROparanormal podcast is based out of. No, it's a scorcher in every sense. We have a true hero, a hero of the people, a hero in a scholarly sense, a hero of spiritualism, and a hero of theology. We have Dr. Nicolas Laos, the philosopher of Metaxiology. He coined the term. He's also an expert in politics. His primary areas of expertise are ontology, epistemology, ethics, philosophical theology, political philosophy, new politics, net war, and cultural diplomacy. His secondary areas of expertise involve geopolitics, geoeconomics, political economy, organizational behavior, hypergame theory, and the history of intelligence. Dr. Laos has a versatile academic and research background. His books include, but are not limited to, The Metaphysics of World Order. His next book, Metaxiology, is a must-read, and, of course, his other book, The Meaning of Being Illuminati. Now, he is going to break it down, and by that I mean explain and show why he is the founder and world Grand Master of the scholarly and political order of the Illuminati. All his initiatives and works in Freemasonry, Esotericism, and New Politics are guided by his position and strategy as Grand Master, so with no further ado, I bring to you Dr. Nicolas Laos. Hello. Yes,
Hello.
a pleasure to speak with you, sir. I'm so excited to talk to you today. Your biography and your accomplishments are tremendous. And, you know, I usually try not to talk to guests about the types of things that we're going to discuss today. In my opinion, you are different. And what I mean by that is you not only have the background and the philosophy involved needed to talk about these things, but you're also a professor. You from an educational perspective, you're involved with the history of these things, and you're interested in the significance of them. And I think theology and philosophy, and I love how you call it the theology of philosophy and the philosophy of theology, because inherently, I think there is a connection. If possible, I'd like to discuss the significance of esotericism and particular esoteric organizations for civilization and a more spiritually elevated political climate. Is your knowledge of this, I mean, there's just so many questions I want to ask. I don't know where to start. Let me start. Give us a little bit of background on yourself and what brought you to this study.
Thank you very much indeed for giving me this opportunity and inviting me to have this discussion with you. Regarding my background, I would like to mention two pillars, if I may use this term, of my background. The first one is, as you mentioned, my scholarly work in the fields of philosophy and theology, where I have conducted my postgraduate and PhD studies, and I have taught in these areas in several institutions. And the second pillar of my background is my activity in the fields of Freemasonry and other esoteric organizations, including the fact that I am the founder and grandmaster of a research and esoteric institution, the scholarly and political order of the Illuminati, about which I have the opportunity to talk later. And I think that it is important to explain how I combine these different activities and roles in the context of esotericism, as you mentioned. In fact, I think it would be useful for our audience to mention that the term esotericism is rather controversial and is often confused with the colloquial adjectival sense of something that is obscure and technical, or that pertains to the minutiae of a particular area of common knowledge. However, the term esotericism derives from the Greek root eso, which means inner, namely pertaining to the inner life of the human being. And indeed, Plato, in his dialogue Alcibiades, uses the expression ta eso, meaning the inner things. And in his dialogue Theaetetus, he uses the expression ta exo, meaning the outside things. Indeed, the Greek adjective esoterikos, esoteric in English, was coined by the rhetorician and satirist Lucian of Samosata in the 2nd century AD in his book The Option of Lives. And the term esoteric first appeared in English in Thomas Stanley's History of Philosophy, which was published in 1701. Thomas Stanley used the term esoteric in order to describe the mystery school of Pythagoras, since the Pythagoreans were divided into the exoteric circle, namely under training, and the esoteric circle, admitted into the inner circle. The corresponding noun esotericism was coined by the French philosopher and historian Jacques Matter in his book Critical History of Gnosticism, published in 1828, and it was popularized in the 19th century French occult world by a famous French occultist, Eliphas Levi. I would like to mention that according to my rationale and research work, esotericism is based on the thesis that every object of consciousness exists not in itself, but inextricably united with the meaning that is assigned to it by consciousness, namely by the mind. Therefore, every manipulation of the meanings that are assigned to things and beings and make the world meaningful is equivalent to a manipulation of the reality of the world itself by the human consciousness. This is, according to my rationale, the ultimate secret of esotericism's power and significance. Furthermore, inherent in my previous argument is a powerful political message, if I may use this term, since the moral autonomy that is achieved through and underpinned by such an interpretation of esotericism implies a high level of personal and social autonomy. And therefore, my goal is to throw light on the ontological potential of the human being, on the autonomy of the human being, and on the meaning of existence. And of course, in order to achieve this goal, I think that one has to follow a synthetic and interdisciplinary approach to issues related to esotericism.
Excellently put. Excellently put. So within the garden of our minds, we need to be very careful of the seeds we sow. You're absolutely right. I'm going to read a little bit from your book, and this is on Metaxiology, which I love that term, and you actually coined that term, which is quite fascinating.
Thank you.
And basically, let's see here, it's the secular perception of individual autonomy, which underpins Nozick's theory of justice and classical political economy, envisages a time when each person will be doing what he or she wills. However, Metaxiology clashes with Nozick's and the classical political economists' perception of freedom of will, because in the manner and the extent in which someone actualizes his or her freedom of will is determined by the commands of the instinct and or the established economic system. Then, as I argued in Chapter 6, human freedom of will becomes a shadow of itself, much like you were saying before that these are very different times.
Indeed, you have mentioned something really important. And I would like to say that from my experience and from my research work, I have realized that the intricacies of ideas are often more complicated and indeed more important than the intricacies of politics. As Zbigniew Brzezinski, the famous former U.S. National Security Advisor, has pointed out, it is ideas that guide politics after all. I would like, right now, what crosses my mind is that the German-American political scientist and political psychologist Franz Neumann, who lived in the first half of the 20th century and is considered to be among the founders of modern political science in Germany, argued in his essay Anxiety in Politics that every political system is based on anxiety, which is a normal feeling of unease, such as worry or fear, intimately related to humanity's attempt to impose its intentionality in history, that is, to restructure humanity's existential conditions according to the intentionality of human consciousness. In fact, I could say that one's anxiety is determined by the discrepancy between that part of historical reality that one controls, makes meaningful, and imposes one's intentionality on, and that part of historical reality that one considers uncontrolled, meaningless, or even chaotic and uncontrollable. In fact, Neumann was inspired by the psychologist Sigmund Freud, who argued in his book Totem and Taboo that society is based on complicity in the common crime, and that the primeval human being is a Darwinian variation condemned to produce civilization, or in other words, a wolf that must be domesticated and indeed civilized. Hence, in order for the values of civilization to survive, this wolf must abandon and transcend one's own existential authenticity, transforming it into language and moral consciousness. My research work, including the term and the theory of metaxis or metaxiology that you mentioned, and my esoteric work, which I delineate in my book, The Meaning of Being Illuminati, make major steps forward by proposing a way in which one can transcend the dichotomy and the conflict between the so-called authenticity of the inner primeval ego and the requests of civilization by curing the sociality of the human soul in the context of my research program of Ur-illumination and metaxis. This is what my books and my work in the field of esotericism aim at offering to my readers and fellows. I propose an existential model that by breaking and overcoming the dilemma between the archetype of the untamed and savage wolf and the archetype of the subjugated and oppressed wolf gives rise to a new way of thinking about civilization and culminates in the deification of humanity. And this is how I could, in fact, summarize the purpose of my theory of Metaxiology, my research program of Illumination, which I delineate in my book, The Meaning of Being Illuminati. So this is the way in which I try to elucidate the concept illumination, and in this it is within this context that I try to articulate a synthetic study of different esoteric societies and traditions.
Philosophy of theology.
Right, indeed.
This new politics and the net war, I really wanted to ask you, these are areas of expertise of yours, and I find that the common crime you mentioned, that wolf that is domesticated, it really isn't a wolf at that point, and transcending that dichotomy in ego, the individualism that you mentioned. Could you go into that just a bit, Dr. Laos?
Regarding this issue, I could summarize my attempt to overcome the dichotomy between the tamed and the untamed wolf through the notion of personhood. A person, as I define it in my research work, is neither a pure individual nor the creation of a collectivity. A person, if I may put it in very simple terms, is a socialized individual, or in a slightly more technical terms, person means an existential otherness in communion. And therefore, personhood has two aspects and indeed components: existential otherness and communion, or individuality and sociality. Therefore, the next step is to see how we can achieve the transition from individualism and collectivism to personalism, namely a transition to personhood. And this has both philosophical, anthropological, cultural, and indeed political consequences and ramifications, since it paves a new way of thinking about civilization itself. And that's why I mentioned earlier that this is a strongly interdisciplinary and synthetic approach and research work.
Oh, I really like that you mention synthetic, Dr. Laos, because it seems that our modern society has synthetically kind of deitized individualism and somewhat ignores the divine spark, which has historically kind of been the intellectual fertile ground for Christianity and in some way heretics as well.
Indeed. I, of course, being in full agreement with what you have mentioned, I would say that every significant religious and spiritual system seeks the participation of the individual in a broader reality, which, far from oppressing, contradicting, or negating the individuality of the individual, enriches and endows it with universalism. Mm-hmm. In other words, by considering the individual not merely as an individual per se, and instead considering the individual as a potential, at least, partaker of an ontological reality of universal values, the good in itself, which we often call God in religious terms, one can endow the individual with a transcendent significance. And when the individual is united with, rather than separated from, its existential telos, ultimate purpose, which is to become actually, ontologically, a partaker of the good in itself, which is essentially transcendent, requires an existential significance that simplistic modern individualism cannot provide and definitely cannot safeguard, because simplistic modern individualism is based merely on conventional truths, not on ontological truths and universal values. And therefore, in the same way that it claims to safeguard the value of the individual and its rights, in the same way and very easily, if everything is a matter of conventional truths, can negate the value of the individual and its rights in the name, for instance, of historical necessities. And therefore, ultimately, we need to endow the human being with ontological underpinnings that safeguard one's individual values, individual freedom, and rights. Because if individual freedoms and rights are merely the result of conventional political truths, then they can very easily be nullified under certain historical circumstances. Whereas through metaphysics, namely by endowing the value of the human being with metaphysical underpinnings, the individual rights and freedoms become ontologically robust rather than thin legal terms.
It's quite interesting, these false constructs. This just from an outside perspective, looking in, it seems like universalism is much more powerful, consistent, and omnipresent as far as being a power than the individualistic power which is popularized by our synthetic society.
Indeed. And in this case, it is very important to clarify the difference between universality and generality. Generality refers to the power of abstraction, namely the power of syllogistic thinking, the power of logic. This is the underlying principle of rationalism, especially in its modern sense. So, according to rationalism, the degree of generality is equivalent to the degree of reality. And this is a very dangerous argument, because if a general concept, like, for instance, humanity, is more real and therefore more important than me and you, then an institution that may claim and convince people that it is the ultimate authority on general concepts may even eliminate you and me exactly on the principle that, and the basis of the principle that the degree of reality is actually the degree of generality. This is the problem with the principle of generality, which underpins collectivism and collectivist societies. On the other hand, as we said before, modern individualism, which is underpinned by nominalism. Nominalism is the philosophical school according to which general principles are mere names. They are not real, hence the name nominalism. We have, as we mentioned before, modern individualism, which is underpinned nominalism, is not the right and the proper response to the principle of generality and collectivism. I think and I maintain that the proper answer is personhood and the notion of universalism, in contrast to the notion of generality. Universalism is a reality that transcends the human individual, but in contrast to generality and abstract concepts, universalism can be participated by the human individual. In other words, the psychic space, the consciousness, if you will, of the human individual can be broadened, can expand in order to contain and accommodate and bear universality. This is the secret of personhood in terms of ontology, that the individual can become a carrier of universality instead of merely carrying only its individuality, its ego.
It definitely seems as if it's a bit of a trick that's being pulled on the general population, in that it seems as if we are stripped of our power by being comfortable and glorified at our base reality, and it seems like this generality is this a manipulation?
I think so, because the principle of generality indeed underpins authoritarianism. Mm-hmm. Because rationalism, and especially when logical structures assume the role of ultimate reality, then the authorities, the ultimate authorities on those logical structures acquire the right and the authority to determine everyone's value and rights on the basis of their privilege to be the ultimate authority on general principles. Because generality is something that rules the individual from the outside and from above, whereas universality is something that transcends the individual, but something that can be participated by the individual. It's like, for instance, what you mentioned about the divine spark within the individual, or the divine grace, or God's uncreated grace. All these poetic, theological, and philosophical terms imply that the ultimate reality can indeed be present within the human being, thus liberating the individual from both inner and outer sources of oppression. And therefore, yes, I totally agree with what you mentioned before. There is an issue of manipulation underlying the confusion between generality and universality. Generality is something that always implies a rule from above, whereas universality is something that can imply that the individual can indeed hold and bear the universal within one's self.
Mm-hmm. It seems that, and I absolutely was fascinated by the idea of God's uncreated grace. I don't know why this, to me, appeared sort of like a sock puppet without a hand in it, and we are being told that we should glorify ourselves, or the sock, let's say, at least denying the power plant that we are able to tap into. And I wonder, could it be that the grasp of the dark path elite is literally, if you're freeing up that much power, if you convince someone, it seems like our value is actually manipulated when it's glorified, when the ego is tickled on its underbelly and told how important it is. It decides to completely negate the reality of where it came from, or at least the universality. Is that am I off, or is that, I don't know why that God's uncreated grace that you mentioned, it really had an effect on me, because it shows that there is power out there for us to utilize, but many individuals, and no pun intended using that name, but many individuals decide to negate that completely. And yet, on the other hand, you find out later that they are very involved. And it brings to mind these scandals with the elite, the Epstein saga, the Weinstein saga. It seems that not only does absolute power breed absolute darkness, but it corrupts absolutely. And this corruption, or this darkness, is really just an erasure of our light, it seems. And I don't know if I'm reading too much into this, but I wonder if this has, and you would know, how this involves politics and how it kind of seeps through the cracks into our political system, which is really governing us. And as you said, Dr. Laos, I'm fascinated by the fact that we have completely been put into boxes and categories, as you said, due to our wealth, our reach, everyone has a credit score. You don't even need to know the person. Just look at their credit score. You don't need to know the person. And this is very common in today's society. You have a credit score. You have to do with, what you look at online, where your true spiritualism may be. Secrets are ignored. The secrets of, it seems, our life, really, in general, something that is historically has been present. It seems like it's being stripped away in this new era, this new, very turbulent and challenging time.
I agree with you regarding everything you have said. Michael Psellos, in 11th century AD Byzantine Hesychast and Neoplatonist philosopher, who has written extensively on the nature of God's uncreated light, and he describes the relation between God's activity and humanity's activity more or less as follows: that we do not always participate in God, even though He's active, because of our lack of receptiveness towards participation. As the sun at midday is always shining, and not everyone is capable of gazing at it, except those who have healthy eyes. In the same way, not everyone is capable of participating in God's uncreated energies, even if even if one deploys the mental light more amply than sunlight, but only those who have a mental eye purified in their soul. And indeed, using the metaphor of the sun and its rays, Laos, like all other Hesiodists and Byzantine mystics, argues that a human being can see the rays or energies of God, which disclose God's mode of being, through an experience of, I could say, illuminated intuition, which is not contra-logical, but translogical, if I may use this term. And therefore, investigating the ontological potential of the human being is a key issue, both for philosophical anthropology and politics and politology, because the way one thinks about the deity and the ontological potential of the human being determines both one's existential horizons and values and one's political thought and political behavior. If I may raise and bring to our discussion, for instance, the issue of Freemasonry, which is very controversial, I would like to relate our discussion with the notion of symbolic building. And this is what I find useful in Freemasonry, which is something not always realized even by Freemasons. In its broadest sense, what we call symbolic or speculative masonry is an initiatory organization that uses symbols and allegories related to operative masonry in order to teach morality and transmit moral virtue, to dramatize philosophical ideas, and to forge fraternal relations. However, beyond this general definition of symbolic masonry, each particular body of symbolic masonry has its own landmarks and ethos. Therefore, there are indeed different masonries. I could say that, like the market of construction companies, which is pluralistic and competitive, the market of symbolic construction companies, namely of symbolic Masonic orders, is pluralistic and competitive too. And I want to relate this issue with what you said before. In general, Freemasonry teaches lessons about building a better human being within a better society through symbols and narratives inspired by the Bible and ancient and medieval operative masonry. But I could say that there are what we might call alienated Masonic institutions, like political institutions, which tend to be obsequious to particular profane power oligopolies and profane institutions, and therefore they ultimately transform Freemasonry into a pro-establishment bourgeois catechetical school imbued with the particular ethos and the particular interests of the particular elites that oversee and manage particular Masonic institutions in different countries. This is why, as I said before, there are indeed different masonries around the world. And at this point, I would like especially to make a small revelation, if I may use this term. Many people are excited about, for instance, certain aspects of Freemasonry, like for instance, the 33rd degree of the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite. And if you give us a few minutes to clarify something about this related to what you said before.
Yes, absolutely.
In symbolic Masonry, there is a didactic myth, the myth of Hirama Biff, who is the symbolic architect of a symbolic temple. Hirama Biff is mentioned in the Bible in 1 Kings, but in the context of Freemasonry, there is a didactic myth mentioning that Hirama Biff was assassinated by 3 unworthy fellow crafts who wanted to acquire the secrets of the Master Mason in an irregular way. However, the meaning of this didactic myth is that Hirama Biff is the principle of spirit which guides humanity if humanity intends to be guided by the spirit, of course, to build a spiritual temple, which is a symbol of a better humanity within a better society. And one has to wait until the 33rd degree in order to realize and be explicitly informed that the 3 assassins who assassinated Hirama Biff, namely the principle of spirituality within humanity, are 3 very well-known forces. The 3 assassins are the distorted notion of law, the distorted notion of material possessions, and the distorted notion of religion. Meaning that the distortion of religion by particular forces, the distorted notion of law and legitimacy by particular forces, and the distorted notion of material possession by particular forces are the ultimate causes of humanity's inability to elevate itself and its institutions to the level that it can potentially elevate them. And this is totally in agreement, as a matter of fact, with Jesus Christ's teachings about law, possession of material wealth, and religion. Because, for instance, when Christ says that the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath, and that he gives a new command to love one another, and when Christ says that it is hard for a rich man to enter into the kingdom of heaven, and when Christ says that you are gods, as he says, as we read in John 10:34, we realize that the cause of humanity's problems is essentially spiritual. And that is why, as I mentioned in the beginning of our discussion, usually, on most occasions, the intricacies of ideas and mentalities are more complicated and indeed more important than the intricacies of politics themselves, because ultimately politics is a reflection of the spiritual underpinnings and the underlying mentalities of political actors. And therefore, we have to delve into the very foundations of the institutions of our society in order to seek substantial solutions to the major problems of humanity. And this is an attempt and a goal to which I try to make a contribution in a very systematic and philosophically rigorous way in my book, The Meaning of Being Illuminati, and in my book, Metaxiology, which you mentioned earlier.
Yes, it's very interesting how that value, it seems to transfer over into politics quite the reality is, I guess it's just proximity to those two states. But I also wanted to ask you, before I forget, these same, call them the black hats and the white hats in modern politics, and how, if at all, they are connected to the white brotherhood and the black brotherhood, if at all.
This is a very important question, and I have dedicated many pages to it in my book, The Meaning of Being Illuminati, where in chapter 3, I study what is the meaning and the significance of the terms white brotherhood and black brotherhood, which are two symbolic terms, but they cover very important historical and political facts. So this is a very nice and very thought-provoking issue. I'll try to summarize it as much as possible in the context of our discussion. First of all, I'd like to say that indeed, in the modern era, the history of secret societies and of political life is inextricably linked to the competition between two powerful global factions, the so-called white brotherhood and the so-called black brotherhood. The Black Brotherhood consists of the traditional feudal elites, the traditional nobility, conservative religious orders such as the Opus Dei and the Knights of Malta, far-right Roman Catholic organizations such as the Dignitatis Humanae Institute, founded by Benjamin Harnwell, a far-right Roman Catholic activist supported by Monsignor Sanchez Saronto, fundamentalist Christian evangelical organizations usually assimilated into the American evangelical right and allied to right-wing Zionism, and such occult groups as Samuel Liddell MacGregor Mather's Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn and Harvard's Scientology. In general, the Black Brotherhood supports various forms of nationalism, the rule of strong state in the sense of Hegelianism, various formalistic and superstitious approaches to religion, various forms of racism, and usually the medieval scholastics' legacy of rationalist authoritarianism. All these are issues and concepts that I systematically investigate and analyze in my book, The Meaning of Being Illuminati. On the other hand, the White Brotherhood consists of an internationalist, financial and mercantile elite, liberal religious orders such as the Society of Jesus, liberal socio-political networks such as the Open Society Foundations, and such occult groups as Blavatsky's Theosophical Society and Aleister Crowley's branch of the OTO and his Order of the Argentino Master. The White Brotherhood supports liberal globalism, the liberalization of society, a Gnostic legacy of religious syncretism, various forms of secularism, radical individualistic voluntarism, and various forms of scientific illuminism. Within these two groups, we can find important positive and negative, creative and destructive aspects operating at the same time. I believe that they have played both positive and negative historical roles as every major historical institution. But I strongly believe that the contemporary stage of humanity calls for a third way esotericism capable of transcending the dichotomy between the Black Brotherhood and the White Brotherhood. And indeed, through my research work, I invite my readers and fellows and associates to investigate this historical option, and indeed to pursue third way esotericism beyond those two traditions, with all its positive and negative aspects, especially for the contemporary world and the contemporary challenges and the contemporary level of anthropological development. In this context, I try to investigate what I call third way esotericism, namely esotericism beyond the Black Brotherhood and the White Brotherhood, through a research program which I call Ur-Illuminism, using the term, the German term Ur, which means something which is foundational or basic, in order to differentiate other notions of Illuminism, and especially the historical order of the Bavarian Illuminati, of course, which was a very particular and local phenomenon. And therefore, I believe that we have not only the historical opportunity, but also, I could dare to say, the historical duty to rediscover and recontextualize the notion of illumination at its most foundational level in order to potentially articulate a research program that can be universally significant. And it is within this context that I propose the use of the notion of personhood in international politics. In international politics, personhood means that all international political actors must be free to experience and maintain their existential otherness, that is their particular logi, but simultaneously they must be aware that they are ontologically dependent on a truth and on fundamental significations, what we call values, that transcend them. And therefore they must have a strong sense of moral responsibility towards the entire humanity, and the international system must operate as a free and fair market in the sense of a free social space of different logi. And indeed, the aforementioned personalistic approach to international politics, which treats the international political actors as persons, safeguards the spiritual freedom and the sociality of the human soul, both at the level of the human individual and at the level of the nation state. I would like to mention, for instance, that modern cosmopolitanism, originally derived from Immanuel Kant, Jeremy Bentham, and Karl Marx, undermines the spiritual freedom and the existential otherness of collective entities such as nation states and regional civilization. And it uses the theory of individual rights in a way that essentially nullifies spiritually significant collective identities, primarily cultures. On the other hand, modern communitarianism, originally derived from Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Johann Gottfried Herder, and Georg Hegel, undermines the sociality of humanity, and it uses the notions of national sovereignty and collective identity in a way that essentially nullifies the sense of personal moral responsibility and the sensitivity to humanity that must guide every civilized international political actor. Both modern cosmopolitanism, which underpins the regime of neoliberal globalization that was established in the 1990s, and modern communitarianism, which underpins the rise of nationalism, populism, and neo- or crypto-fascism at the dawn of the 21st century as a revolt against the established system of globalization, are flawed and create more problems than they solve. That's why I believe that we should consider applying the notion of personhood in the sphere of international politics. And this, I believe, we have to consider humanity at a stage in the context of which it should attempt and try, and systematically indeed try, to ascend a new kind of humanity which I would call homo valorum, which is a Latin term that means human of values. We have, for instance, homo sapiens, the model of an intellectually advanced human being. Homo valorum, I think, is what we need today, the human of values, who denies the fatalism of the facts and emphasizes the notion of personhood. And as I said, inherent in the notion of personhood are both the notion of existential otherness and the notion of communion. And therefore, in the realm of international politics, the notion of existential otherness corresponds to the notion of an international or geopolitical pole, while the notion of communion corresponds to the notion of a world society. Therefore, we have to try to combine the notion of international political or geopolitical pole and the notion of a world society. And in this way, we have to transcend polarity, while, as I said before, preserving and maintaining and supporting the notion of particularity, but particularity within universality and endowed with universality.
Oh, particular personhood, so well explained. I can't thank you enough for the time, effort, and work that you've invested in being just a beacon of light in our synthetically dominant false constructs that we encounter rigorously, it seems like, in our challenging modern era. Your books and places where our listeners can find you, Dr. Laos.
My last book is the book entitled The Meaning of Being Illuminati, which is a general theory of illumination. And it was published this July 2019, by Cambridge Scholars Publishing in England. So my book, The Meaning of Being Illuminati, can be found through my publisher, Cambridge Scholars Publishing, through Amazon and through other physical and electronic bookstores. And my book, Metaxiology, which is my work in the field of theological philosophy and philosophical theology, was published in the United States by Pickwick Publications, and of course it is available through the publisher and again through Amazon and any other physical and electronic bookstore. My book, The Meaning of Being Illuminati, was published this year. My book, Metaxiology, was published in 2016. And of course, I welcome everyone who wants to have a discussion regarding these issues. My website is www.nicolaslaos.com. And I wish to thank you very much indeed for this discussion.
Absolutely. And I have so many more questions. I wanted to get into the order of 777, but we'll have to save it for another time, Dr. Laos. Your revelatory insights are like a beacon of light as we trudge along this path to our great reward. I am but a humble servant. Thank you for your time. So many thanks and blessings.
Thank you very much. I'm grateful to you. Thank you very much indeed.
Boom. Hello. Unreal. I'm blown away. What a hero. The guy is a rock star. Dr. Nicolas Laos, scholar, author, professor, grand master, one of the most decent gentlemen I've had the honor of talking to. Please do what you can. Buy his books, check out his website, and support his efforts as he helps humanity understand their purpose in this construct we live. And pick up a copy of Metaxiology. and the meaning of being Illuminati. They all are amazing works, and his collection of knowledge is very substantial. Until next time, guys, go by and check out the Hero Paranormal website. Pick up some swag, some t-shirts, some hats if you want to make your neighbors wonder what you're into. Or slide by Space Wolf Research. Shoot us a email, ask what's going on. We're getting all kinds of stuff out in the crazy shapeshifter territory that we are researching. But more importantly, let's keep our eyes to the skies, feet on the ground, but don't forget to take a look around.
Come blast off in my time machine. Third eye feeling like an Evazine. Blast off, blast off, blast off, blast off. Come blast off in my time machine. Third eye feeling like an Evazine. Blast off.